Lynne is an associate professor of philosophy here at the University of Connecticut after having had appointments at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and for many years at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. She's most well known for her work on issues concerning language and power and social justice, and particularly around the issues of speech, hate speech, and speech that surrounds and often incites genocide. Her work on this topic in seminal articles like Genocidal Language Games has been really it's an understatement to say that it has caught fire and taken up in the literature to a great extent in recent years. So much so that, for example, a recent visitor to the University of Connecticut from Yale noted that for many of us, we seem like we're all Tirrellians now who work on speech and discourse. Her work on Rwanda in particular has attracted international attention, and deservedly so. She's a philosopher who has a great sensitivity not only to the finer points of language, but the finer points of what matters to human beings. Join me in welcoming Lynne.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm really honored to be here today and to be part of both the UConn Philosophy Department and the Humanities Institute, and to serve with my colleagues on the Gladstein Committee on Human Rights. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all, and an honor to have my work supported in the way that you all are supporting it. So my cover slide has lots of different examples of things people told me were toxic when I asked them, what do you think toxic speech is? And the sort of number one answer people give is hate speech. Philosophers would say slurs because that's a term of the art now in philosophy. But I'm actually not going to be, I have published about hate speech and slurs, and that's not what today's talk is about. And incitement, well, we have one of the foremost experts on incitement here in the room today, so I'm not going to lecture about incitement either, but I do want to take the lens from hate speech and kind of broaden it out. And thinking about incitement, you think about how is it that a group of people can be incited to commit violence against their friends, or their former friends, they're committing violence against them, or their family members. How can that happen? Take a step back and look at the changing discursive practices in the community that make those incitement moves possible. So I'm talking about toxic speech. My topic of toxic speech is sort of further back and sometimes a little bit underground until you look at it and then you say, whoa, I see it now. I see that as toxic. So here's an example. So I don't actually like the term hate speech. And the reason is I don't think it's very rarely about hate. It is sometimes about hate. So this is a quote from Pio Mutingahari, a convicted genocidaire from Rwanda. It's cited in Hatzfeld's book, Machete Season. And he says, maybe we did not hate all the Tutsis, especially our neighbors, and maybe we did not see them as wicked enemies, but among ourselves we said we no longer wanted to live together. We even said we did not want them anywhere around us anymore, and that we had to clear them from our land. It's serious saying that. It's already sharpening the machete. That's easy to see in hindsight in Rwanda. But what about here in the US, where people started to talk about Muslims as terrorists, and people didn't blink? Some people blinked, but a lot of people didn't blink. It's already sharp. It's serious saying that. It's already sharpening the machete. So one of my questions in my research has been, how do you get from just saying we don't want to live near them anymore to sharpening the machete? And I'm not actually going to answer that whole question today, but I'll give you some tools to give you some hints in that direction. So jump to a completely different place in time. The German linguist Victor Klemper, in his book, The Language of the Third Reich, this is, I think, the locus classicus of the concept of toxic speech. And he says, I often cite just the end. My friend Jason Stanley often cites just the end too. But I think the whole thing is worth looking at. He says, Nazism permeated the flesh and blood of the people. I want to emphasize that, the flesh and blood, through single words, idioms, and sentence structures which were imposed on them in a million repetitions and taken on board mechanically and unconsciously. One tends to understand Schiller's distich on a cultivated language which writes and thinks for you in purely aesthetic and, as it were, harmless terms. Apologies for the art historians and artists here who don't think aesthetics is harmless at all, because it's not. But language does not simply write and think for me. It increasingly dictates my feelings and governs my entire spiritual being, the more unquestioningly and unconsciously I abandon myself to it. And what happens if the cultivated language is made up of poisonous elements or has been made the bearer of poisons? And then this is the sort of money quote. Words can be like tiny doses of arsenic. They are swallowed unnoticed and appear to have little effect. And then after a little time, the toxic reaction sets in after all. So my research project is to try to show that toxic speech has real health effects. So then you say, well, real health effects on who or what? And so that has to be operating on multiple levels, on individuals, on the social body, and on political institutions, damaging democratic reasoning and democratic functioning. How does it do that? Well, one way is by polarizing. I don't want to say just us-them dichotomies, because we need us-them all over the place. The philosophy department is not the history department, right? The history department is not sociology. That doesn't, it matters for a lot of things, but it isn't polarization. Polarization, I think, is the problem. When us-them differences become polarized. Dehumanization, and what do these things generate? Fear, anxiety, anger, disgust, and wariness. Wariness, I could have put distrust, but I want wariness as a way of putting the orientation on the people who are most likely to be harmed. So that takes us to how do you talk about harms? So I went to Claudia Card in her paper, Surviving Poverty, which is in a collection edited by UConn's own Diana T. Myers. Harms in health. As basics, she lists some basics for decent functioning, and this is very normative. It's normative through and through. So her first part of the list is access to non-toxic air, water, and food, sleep, and the ability to move one's limbs. That's very material, right? Just being able to physically do these things and getting the right physical inputs. The next one, the ability to make choices concerning the shape and direction of one's life and to act on some of them. That's really about autonomy. Of course, the ability to move one's limbs is also connected to autonomy. So those kind of overlap, which is why I have those blue lines. Then, the next part of the list seems much more entwined with our discursive practices. Freedom from severe and unremitting pain, that can be either material or non-material, spiritual, psychological, cognitive. Freedom from severe and unremitting pain and from deep shame and humiliation. Affective bonds with others, we need those to be who we are. A secure sense of one's human worth. That's not your human worth above and beyond anybody else, but just that you have it, that you are worthy as a human. And she says, last but not least, the ability to hope. Those last four, I want to say, are all intertwined with what we say to and about each other. How we describe our world. Not just how we describe, but also our modes of interaction with each other. So language. I start with Wittgenstein. Language discussions started way before Wittgenstein. In some of my work, I start with Locke. but he's not so useful for this context. So here, Wittgenstein has this concept of the language game. But if we think about language games, where do they fit with things like speech acts, and then I'm talking about practices? It can get really messy. So I got this handy graph or chart from PowerPoint that actually conveyed exactly what I want. They're nested. So speech acts are the most local. I say Tracy nodded her head. Thank you for nodding. Tracy nodded her head, but that's within a language game of recognizing your audience, right? Or your friends in the audience. But that's within a broader array of discursive practices, which has to do with things like recognizing the other. And that's within a broad array of social practices. So the interplay of these levels, if I could make this somehow more dynamic, I'd say these are all like semi-permeable membranes in an organism, because there's not hard walls around each of these. The speech act can't be what it is unless there's a language game within which it's operating, and that can't happen unless we have discursive practices in general that are helping us to distinguish which language game we're in, and for that we need broader social practices. So I'm getting breathless, so I know that went by fast. So the first quote, a language game is the whole. And I pause there because it really is about the whole consisting of the language and the actions into which it is woven. So when I talk about language, I'm with Wittgenstein. It's not just the words. The speech act is always dragging along or nested within its context. So then he also says, you know, from section 7 to section 23, the term language game is meant to bring into prominence the fact that speaking a language, the speaking of a language is part of an activity or of a form of life. I recently got back page proofs on a paper that's appearing in a law review article, and law review editors are like just amazingly detailed, right? And so they wanted me to change a form of life to life form. And you check all, right? But it is shorter. Right? But you get the difference that it's a form of life is something much broader. And yet, there's a way in which, I mean, I actually puzzled about this for a few minutes because I wasn't going to let them change it, but I was like, where's my resistance coming from in a more detailed way? Because part of what I think is that if you don't have these games, certain ways of being cannot happen, and so certain life forms cannot emerge. Okay, not to get too Star Trek-y, especially after the Tirrellian thing. Okay, but so, it's all, these things are all mutually dependent. Now, my teacher, Wilfrid Sellers, wrote a paper before I was born called Some Reflections on Language Games. And in that, he kind of violated Wittgenstein's rules. One of Wittgenstein's strong pronouncements, anyway, is there's not rules. These are don't try to get all logical on the language games. It's not. That's a fool's errand. Well, Sellers didn't get too logical about it, but he said, look, when you think about a game, there's three kind of big moves. There's getting into the game, there's moves you make inside the game, and then there's getting out of the game. And if you think about all the different games you know, that's pretty much true. So when you talk about entering a language game, what do you do? And he was concerned with observation sentences like "lo, rabbit." Since we're at UConn, I put "lo, husky." Like, "lo, yonder is a husky." And that observation sentence puts you in the husky observation game, right? And you get to take a position in the game, and that takes you from the world to words. And now you can just talk a lot about huskies and other things. But then when you're talking a lot about huskies and other things, those moves are going to be language moves. A lot of what we do is operate in that central realm. So the language moves, that's where we draw inferences from things other people have said or from our observations. And we sometimes, and when we draw an inference and we state an assertion, other people can take that up. We license them to say it again. I'll come back to this in a minute. And we can also defer. Someone else can say, oh, well, Lynn said it. And that's all word to word. And then finally, exit moves. And that's where I spend a lot of my time worrying about language and genocide. Actions within the game, all those internal language moves. Oh, I can call my neighbor who is Tutsi, I can now call them a cockroach. I can call them a snake. I can treat them like they're that. Move to treatment is picking up part of the inferential role, and it's licensing behaviors outside the language game. So my classic example is an MD's prescription. You go in, you have a bunch of symptoms that you notice those are observations. Then you go see the doctor, and you tell the doctor, that's your report, is language stuff. And the doctor listens to the report. Maybe they make some observations of their own, I hope, and then they issue a prescription that takes you out of the consultation game and into the world. So here is Kate Jewell's family, part of it. It's my colleague at the Institute. I asked her for a picture of her family, and Kate says, here's my husband Connor pushing our Neve to the playground. Now, I've met Kate many times, but I haven't met Connor yet. They're in Belmont, Mass. Little out of the way, but not completely. And I've never met Neve. But once Kate says that, here's my husband Connor pushing our Neve to the playground, I get to say Connor and Neve went to the playground. Do you think that's right? Yeah. Simple. Really simple. Someone says, how do you know? And I say, Kate said so. Really simple. That's how licenses work. You use the language of license, it sounds really formal. We could use the language of permissions. There's a whole other bunch of philosophers who talk about permissibility and permissibility facts. Same thing. Okay, so Brandom says inferring, which we usually think of as like a mental state of moving from one proposition to another one, is a kind of doing. And then he wants to say, so of course that brings on responsibilities. So I left this out on the side, that once that inference license that Kate has a husband Connor and a daughter Neve is issued, that's transferable. You've all heard it now, so you can say, one of our fellows at the Institute has a daughter named Neve. I've always liked that name, right? You can walk out and say all kinds of things. And then you can defer it back to Kate, or you can defer it to me because I reported on what Kate said. And, you know, if Kate says this, and I know her really well, and I say, Kate, sorry, that's your sister's family. What's up with you? That's a challenge. It's not her sister's family. That would be a false challenge, an unjustified challenge. But we can do that kind of thing. Okay. So that's like a rushed overview of the way this model works, which gets at issues about sharing content, communicability, responsibility. So, inferences. This is Maxime's dissertation director and my friend Ray Langton. Some varieties of toxic inference. This is from a really old paper, 1993. Speech acts and unspeakable acts. And she talks about the whites only sign. So the speech act doesn't have to be uttered, right? A sign like that is a speech act. And Langton says, some of these things are illocutionary acts of subordination. This sign would be one. And one of the, well, she identifies 3 features of illocutionary acts of subordination. One, in this case, the sign ranks blacks as having inferior worth. So ranking. Second, legitimate discriminatory behavior. That's in my picture on the exit side, on the part of whites. And finally, deprive blacks of some important powers. For example, to go to certain areas and the power to vote. We're seeing that reemerge in today's climate. So the categories of Salarzian moves on this rank, legitimate, deprive picture. Ranking is language, that's internal. Legitimating is licensing, discrimination, that's an exit move. And depriving is an exit move. So right now I'm just trying to convince you that this structure is interesting and worthwhile. And then we'll see what we can do with it. So commitments. When we speak, we make certain commitments. I'm going to skip a little bit over identificatory. We have to say, which Connor, which Neve. Make assertional commitments to what we say. But what I think is most interesting for toxic speech is this third category, expressive commitments to the viability and value of a particular way of talking. So, using insect talk to talk about human beings. That's a mode of discourse. And people who do that and say, oh, immigrants are like an invasion of, pick your favorite awful insect or rodent or whatever, people who say that kind of thing, they are making an expressive commitment to the viability and value of using that kind of, not just animal discourse, but unwanted and dangerous animal discourse to talk about human beings. So when you undertake an expressive commitment, and if you hear somebody do this, you can say, oh, you just made an expressive commitment to using insect talk to talk about humans. How do you defend that? Of course, everyone will think you're like a pesky nerd, but they probably already did. Because people who are inclined to ask those kind of questions get that treatment. Okay. So on the bottom of the slide, I have just some notes that as we do these things, we track the moves. As we go through discourse, we track the moves, those that are made and those that are available. We look at people's commitments. What have they already committed to? And what licenses have they issued to other people? Today on Facebook, one of my friends posted something about trying to figure out whether to unfriend certain people who use, and they listed some modes of discourse. I did not jump in. I was busy preparing for now, but I thought, wow, they are actually onto the concept of expressive commitment, and they're saying this person's expressive commitments are making me very uncomfortable. The way they talk about other people is making me very uncomfortable. And so they're thinking about taking action. Okay, so now I'm turning to the medical, chemical, social epidemiology side of my project, which is, I start off, well, so if you're going to call speech toxic, what is toxicity, right? And so I just went to the experts who say the degree to which a substance, a toxin or poison can harm humans or animals. Philosophers won't like this because it has toxin in there, but we'll just take toxin out. So the degree to which a substance, such as a poison, can harm human or animals counts as the degree of toxicity. All we need to know is that it can be acute. If you think about the varieties of toxic speech, a hurled epithet. I turn to, is anyone in the room named Fred? Okay, I turn to Fred and I say, Fred, you so-and-so, where so-and-so is an epithet. Okay, that is like, that's acute. That would be acute toxicity, and it would be like a punch in the nose. But the Klemper quote we looked at, that's really about chronic toxicity, where it builds up and it just keeps going. Okay. And eventually you realize you've changed, things have changed around you, you're behaving in ways and you're saying things you're not so happy with. So there's an issue for my model that we could talk about, which is about poisons versus viruses. Viruses are contagious, highly contagious. Poisons are like one-shot deals. I mean, if you poison the water system, but each time it's a one-shot deal. So in social epidemiology, they do track viruses too, more than poisons. If you look at this list, it's not crucial, there's no quiz on this list over here, but they're pretty serious things, especially in the top. And this is how many people die when they come in contact with it. with or without treatment, depending. So the list is based on the percentage of mortality once infected, the numbers killed, and then the spread, the threat assessment. To assess the threat, consider, this is still from the epidemiology side, the mode of transmission, the probability of infection, the availability of treatment. So my project is to try to figure out if there are language parallels to that. Are there things that are modes of discourse that are so easily transmittable that they are highly likely to cause infection and maybe not so easy to treat against? So at first when I was doing this project, I was thinking these toxicity factors all come from various epidemiology textbooks. It's kind of standard material. There's the material, the dose, the route, and susceptibility. What I like about this is think about things like toxic speech, hate speech, just nasty discourse. Some people just like let it roll, and some people are very susceptible to it. So that's the bottom, uptake. Uptake is a very common concept in speech act theory. But in epidemiology, it's what kind of absorption is there? And they ask, do we have immunities to it? And how pervious or impervious are we to it? And I think asking those questions about our conversations and our discourse is interesting. I also think it could be very dangerous. It could be a dangerous way to go, but it's really interesting, so let's see what we learn. When I first started thinking about the material, the toxin, I was thinking racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, ableism, the list goes on. I was looking at all the isms. And now I don't think the isms are the material. I think the material is fear, disgust, and loathing. And the isms are ways of packaging that material and targeting the material. So the route, the dose is pretty clear, but the route, through speech acts, images, media arts, and advertising, meaningful gestures, attention, ignoring, these are all different ways of delivering messages of regard, disregard, and more. So we might want to come back to this later in discussion. This is a kind of tricky part of the project. So if you're going to talk about social epidemiology and discursive epidemiology, then the topics of morbidity and mortality come up. So that's something that is part of how you track how dangerous something is. So discursive morbidity, the degree to which a discourse is unhealthy for those engaged in its use. When my son was in school, in high school, all of my friends who had kids his same age were really worried about the unhealthiness of World of Warcraft, which is not a mode of discourse, but it's a game. And they saw it as this activity, it's a computer game that sucked the kids in and then would sap their creative energy and their intellectual, damage their intellectual growth and so on. I'm kind of thinking, well, are there modes of discourse that do that in ways that are problematic? And how would we identify them? I don't have an answer, but I'm looking for one, so if you have ideas. Toxic expressive commitments, I say, close down modes of being. Not necessarily for everyone, because remember the susceptibility issue, but for a lot of people. So what do I mean by close down modes of being? That they make certain modes of life, certain ways of being utterly impossible, closing social pathways, so the person is not capable to be carried forward into the future. Part of what I'm thinking about there is a book by Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope, where he talks about Native Americans. It's a long digression, but I also think everyday racism does that. I think everyday misogyny does that. I think it's really problematic. And at the back of it is a kind of recognition harm. Recognition harms don't deal death, but they twist the things that you do Langton would say they changed their illocutionary force by way of denial, minimization, and other things, which is pretty standard for genocide. So the tricky thing is discursive mortality. I was on philosophy talks and they were like, can speech kill? Lynne Tirrell. Answer that question. And that is like not a question I actually want to answer. That was actually good timing. I don't want to answer that question. But what would it mean? And so, you know, when you get to causal and you talk about incitement, you can say this speech act led to actions that led to death. But did the speech act alone do it? Well, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda said yes. But then people criticized that. That's a tricky area. I'm kind of on board with saying, yeah, it did, but what about everyday recognition harms that we engage in? We as a culture, I don't mean you and I, we as a culture engage in all the time. Do they actually kill people? I bet you're thinking of examples right now, especially those of you who read newspapers and keep up with things. So I want to make sure to spend a minute on something that my philosophy colleague J.C. Beale said in talking about logic. And he has this concept in talking about the law of non-contradiction that worked perfectly for what I think happens when people are reacting to some kind of norm violation in discourse. And so on the one hand, there's the shriek. And the shriek is, oh my God, you can't say that, how could you? Where that person still has expectations of civility, and in saying that, they're questioning the license that's been issued. So you use a racist or a sexist term and someone says, I can't believe you said that. They're challenging your license. On the other end of the continuum, there's all sorts of things in between shrieks and shrugs, is the person who says, what are you going to do? What can I do? Total resignation. When that happens, the civility norm is weakened, and the license stands. And it's like it's just floating there for anybody to take up. And I want people to realize that that's what happens. It's just there for anyone to take up if you let it stand. And then you're complicit through your silence. Rule number 1 in public speaking, don't blame the audience. Okay, so what do when you are somewhere not at the shrug end? And the answer is you challenge what was said. And there's two main ways we challenge. One is we challenge the assertion, and you say, that's not true about Fred. Xavier says Fred is a so-and-so. Sally says to Xavier, that's not true about Fred. That challenges the application of so-and-so to Fred, but it doesn't do much. So a stronger thing is to challenge the assertional commitment and say, we don't talk about humans that way. Sounds a little bit like a kindergarten teacher. Xavier, use your words. Those are not the right words. It does sound pedantic and like a kindergarten teacher. But we do this kind of norming of each other all the time. And if we can't do it when it matters, where our civility norms may be completely undermined, then where else are we going to do it? Okay, so quickly, responses to toxicity can generally go in two directions. Either individual protections, and I have the 3 monkeys there on purpose because they're hiding. And that's self-care, avoidance, reparative tonics, and also direct interventions, attempts to convert somebody. You have a friend who turns out to be a white supremacist, and you say, how can you do that? And you're on the shriek end, but you bring it in a little bit so that you can actually talk. And if you're interested in that, there's some very good books about how that's gone. On the other side is collective action, which involves social protest, shared norm changing, and structural change. I think we need both. It's not an either or. And each one is strengthened by the presence of the other. So Claudia Rankine was recently here. I love her book, Citizen and American Lyric. I recommend it to you strongly. And in it, so a large part of the project that I'm not going to talk about is inoculations, that question, can we create preventions so that people become less susceptible? And I read this passage from Rankine, and it was a kind of challenge to the very concept of inoculations, because in a lot of anti-oppression work, people have said, well, you know, the way to fight the oppression is to build relationships across difference. And personal relationships make all the difference in the world. This is something I have always believed. So here's Rankine. A friend argues that Americans battle between the historical self and the self-self. By this she means you mostly interact as friends with mutual interest and for the most part compatible personalities. However, sometimes your historical selves, her white self and your black self, or your white self and her black self, arrive with the full force of your American positioning. Then you are standing face to face in seconds that wipe the affable smiles right from your mouths. What did you say? Instantaneously, your attachment seems fragile, tenuous, subject to any transgression of your historical self. And though your joined personal histories are supposed to save you from misunderstandings, they usually cause you to understand all too well what is meant. I've been working on the inoculations part of this book, and this passage got me so depressed. Not that I should be sharing, you know, emotional reactions, but it is a fellows talk, and I was like, holy cow, you know, she's right. But then when I kind of got out of my little funk about it, I thought that's why we need these two parts. That's why we need both individual protection, building those friendships, and social change so that the historical self changes. Depression slightly lifted, not all the way. Because that historical self change is really hard. Okay, so I have one more passage from Rankine. She says, another friend tells you you have to learn not to absorb the world. I love that advice. She says sometimes she can hear her own voice saying silently to whomever, you are saying this thing and I am not going to accept it. Your friend refuses to carry what doesn't belong to her. That's also from Citizen. So this reminded me of, and actually there's a couple of elements of this in passage. The passage brought to mind a sort of summary part of Blair Johnson, and you say Akopchuk? Akopchuk's paper from 2018, that resilience is enhanced by, first, positive appraisal coping. So think about that. What is she doing? She says, she can hear her own voice saying, you're saying this thing and I'm not going to accept it. There's a kind of self-appraisal and turning that positive. Effective cognitive and emotional regulation. I think her friend is exhibiting that, but she isn't. And then I put Twitter in parentheses because Twitter is the place that's designed to make you not regulate your emotions, right? It's designed to just elicit knee-jerk responses. And any kind of context like that is going to be really hard on your resilience. Self-efficacy takes us back to autonomy as a crucial element of health. And so speech that fosters autonomy is going to be speech that we really want to promote, and speech that shuts it down is going to be problematic. Strong social support, and then family bonds. And both of those, I just want to put a little, I love this list, and it also, for those of you who've ever read Maria Lugonis's paper on playfulness, world traveling, and loving perception, she has a set of traits that are what it means to be at ease in the world. And there's a lot of connection to this here. Okay. more speech collectively delivered. This is clowns in Germany. Clowns across, they're mocking Nazis and neo-Nazis. I'm not going to go into that right now. I'm going to skip this, skip that, and I want to end here with a quote from Klemper, which we already looked at. And this passage from, or this poem from Emily Dickinson, she says, "A word is dead when it is said, some say. I say it just begins to live that day." I'm with Dickinson. Thank you for coming today.
Okay, so we have time for questions and comments. So, Matt?
Thank you. Can you restate again the World of Warcraft question?
So the question, the World of Warcraft example is parents who are worried about the deleterious effect of participating in that game, which is not strictly a language game. It's computer, massive, multiplayer, online, whatever, MMORPG. Anyway, it's that. And parents being worried about the deleterious effects of that on both the cognitive and affective development of their kids.
Okay.
And so there's definitely paternalism in that, right? Parents, kids. But I actually think this question about what are the games you're participating in and what is their effect on you is one that we should individually and collectively talk about.
Because I actually think World of Warcraft also has a great stand-in also for in this this epidemiology kind of idea, because it's also a lab or like a place where hate speech and toxic speech is cultured, where a young person is exposed to it so often that it eats away at the norms of that, and to the point that young people are so kind of badly the opposite of inoculant. They're like that they consume so much of it that they carry that out into the regular world and no longer see it as offensive anymore.
Oh.
Because I think so much about like both certain social media, but also especially video games, is within the social world of these games, not having really anything to do with the game itself. That there is like a norm and a code of speech that absolutely, like, this kind of toxic speech is like central to. It takes on different meanings that people carry out into the world and enact those in different ways.
I could imagine too, I never played it. I was around younger people who played it. But I could imagine that within that world where certain kinds of toxic discourse were normal, right, that there would be whole modes of speech that became familiar to the players, that then they might say, like, I could imagine, graduate students who are here, please don't ever do this in my class because I'll freak out. But they could say, oh, well, let's say Erdblurg is some word from World of Warcraft. And and I walk into the room and someone says, you're looking like a particularly great Erdblurg today. And it sounds really nice, but actually Erdblurg is a terrible thing to say to somebody, and I would have no clue. And everybody else might smile and say, yes. And like they're all gaslighting me, but I don't even know, right? So like that could happen. I'm not paranoid. But I hate giving away these kinds of examples because, so that the migration from one game to another game can be partial, and then that can be extremely useful. The way slaves had their own ways of telling it slant, and the way Cockneys invented rhyming slang, which they're completely different purposes and so on. But
well, I just think about there were like a bunch of like teenagers at Charlottesville who said they had like learned about the event, learned the worldview of the white supremacists at the event on video games, and also had adopted their kind of like doing it for the laughs, just trolling, am I serious, am I not, that kind of stance also in video games. And so they're like then being indoctrinated and then going out into the world. So these kind of insular social spaces as labs for this kind of hate speeches.
It
Really
also
interesting.
raises questions about how serious they are about how they're only trolling. Kind of like the Rwandan genocidaires who said, oh, well, we didn't really hate them. Like, some of them didn't hate them, so I'm facing that. But some of them did hate. So, like, or even more pointedly in support of what you're saying, the ones who said, we were overtaken by a collective madness. And it wasn't us, right? It was the language made us do it. The radio made us do it. And then there's a kind of pushing away the personal responsibility. And I think with the trolling, we were just trolling, this was just for laughs. There's a way in which there's a denial of personal responsibility.
Heather Baddeley.
Fantastic, love.
Thank you, Heather.
So, I was thinking about whether there are situations where toxic speech could produce overall good effects if used by marginalized populations to protect themselves against oppressors and or to try to bring about greater social equality. So I don't know that I would want to endorse that. I just wanted to sort of throw it out there and see if you thought about it, or if you had, what you thought about it, whether toxic speech could ever be, I mean, ordinarily, of course, toxic speech, I assume, is used by dominant populations, right, against marginalized populations, or it could be used by one individual against another individual. But could it produce some beneficial effects if it's used by marginalized populations to protect themselves? Or do you see where I'm?
Yeah. So, there's a literature on that with respect to hate speech and slurs and the reclaiming of certain derogatory terms. But it's contentious. There are people who say, oh yeah, well, if you're African American and you use the N-word, then it's okay, but if you're white, you can never use it. So identity shapes the range of acceptable utterances that you can make, and it actually shapes the very inferential role that you can appeal to. Although I'm probably the only one who would say it that way, because the rest are Griceans and have a different kind of model. But if you think about something like reclaiming a hate speech term by the people who've been targeted, that remains controversial because you have to identify you have to identify who the speaker is. You have to, there's a lot of very nuanced contextual work that has to go on, and the licenses that we issue are issued really kind of to anyone who encounters the Speech Act. So that's tricky. And sometimes within a marginalized group, a term that the dominant group has used against them will be used within the marginalized group against each other. And so this is why I think the words are not the whole story. It's got to be the practices. And so there are going to be practices of members of a marginalized group, like reaching out of the marginalized group to grab speech acts that are harmful when issued, say, by the oppressors, and throwing them at someone they're mad at or someone that they want to put down in some way. And so, do I think it can ever happen? I think it has happened at times. I think a really good example, when you're just talking about terms, is queer. Because queer has been reclaimed pretty strongly. It's not like it can never be used in a negative way, but it's been reclaimed pretty strongly.
Catherine.
Totally fascinating. And I was thinking sort of along similar lines as Matt, I think. And since we're talking about communicability and toxicity and sort of infection, I was going to ask you about vectors and whether the vectors matter in your model. In other words, is it you mentioned Twitter as a kind of unique place in which people are encouraged not to regulate emotion. Is social media a kind of qualitatively different platform for some of these speech acts, or different kinds of media? Does that matter? Do you have the sense that we may be, playing different kinds of language games in some of these different arenas?
Yes. I don't want to just stop at yes, but yes, I think that's a really great question. I haven't done any specific work using the concept of vector. I've been making language games do all the work so far, but I haven't written the stuff on social media yet. And so that's where I think it's going to come into play. And so, and then looking at games within games and how they can either pull together or pull apart. But one of the questions that I think is behind what you're asking is, well, so many millions, billions of people worldwide are participating in these social media platforms, and some of them really are toxic. So I know someone who is a social media, worked for a company that monitored social media and developed social media profiles for people and stuff. And when I said I was on Twitter, this person said, "Get off." And this is someone who works by managing other people's Twitter accounts. And just said, "Twitter is a cesspool, get off." That was his word, cesspool. And I said, well, it's my presence is pretty minimal on Twitter. And the answer was, you're in the game. That's not a game you should be in. And I thought that was really interesting and something to think about. But the next question is, if you're in it, does it damage you in terms of the kinds of ways that you operate and understand the world? Does it harm your autonomy? Does it make you, in some ways, a less respectful and responsive interlocutor for people, and so on? And I think the answer to that for certain of these platforms like Twitter is probably yes. So I think vectors do matter.
Kathy?
I think I have two kind of linked things. One was that today Kathy Berger, one of our former anthropology students, gave a talk at lunch around mostly around counter speech moves in the kind of dangerous speech category. And I think it's an interesting notion. They're tracing globally collectives of people that are choosing to go in and do direct intervention in social media, but they're doing it collectively. And they're kind of liking and trying to draw attention to ideas that counter dangerous, toxic, or hate speech, depending on how it's being defined. And so that project right now is actually, they're doing research on, it started in Sweden and then it's starting to move in India. There's even a collective in the US. And I was thinking that in terms of the medium, how does it work when these language games are moving transnationally between groups that might be loosely considered to be similar? And I couldn't help but thinking about the use of a nationalist song that was part of the Mladic trial. Like, it's played by the person, the Australian person who did the attacks in Christchurch, and the kind of amalgamation of these different kind of symbols, some verbal, some kind of outside of those boundaries. How does that play out in this idea? Are there transnational forms, or are these really rooted? How do you account for kind of the pluralism and some shared meanings, but then slippage and reuse of other meanings?
I think you said that really well. So do I have an account of it? No, not yet. Do I think that is, I think you've identified something that's very real. I think that we have become, in some ways, because of the internet and these huge platforms, we have become much more of a global village. And so, but the thing is, when you're part of a global village, and think back, let me interrupt myself on this, when you think back to the language entry language, language, and then language exit moves. When you enter, say, the white supremacy game, there's certain language games that are part of it, but there's also practices and other things that these people are participating in. When they do that, very often they will appropriate things from Nazi Germany, they will appropriate things from a variety of white supremacy cultures, and sometimes they appropriate, I'm using that word on purpose, I've said it like 3 times now, they appropriate it incorrectly, right? So they appropriate it for their own purposes. And they want to invoke that painful history, but they're doing something slightly different with it. And so that's something that has to be tracked. And one of the things that I think this model, the inferential role model, lets you do is track those changes. And so in certain contexts, I mean, the primary voice and developer of the inferential role theory of meaning is Bob Brandom at Pittsburgh. And he has this very robust and detailed account of how these inferential roles work. But he doesn't want to, it's very abstract. And it is tied to concrete everyday life, but non-political, problematic everyday life, right? And so when you start bringing that stuff in, you get some issues. And one of them is, on his view, once something's out there as a licensed inference, it's part of the inferential role of that expression. And it's just there for everyone. It's like part of the network. It's there. And anyone can grab it. But I don't think that's always true in everyday context, because not everybody can reach it, if you want to use that grab metaphor. And questions of salience, which of the inferential, which of the inferences are most salient in a particular context, that has to be tracked. So I tend to think about that, again, with a visual metaphor, that there's this big network, but only certain of the inferences, which we track like in a spider web, only some of those are going to light up on any given occasion. And the thing with the Charlottesville neo-Nazi who says Jews will not replace us, or chants blood and soil, they might know it comes from the Nazis, but do they know the history? Do they really know? And some of them, the answer is yes, and that's really scary. And some of them, it is, to go back to Matt's point, just fun for them. And that's scary in a different kind of way. And we need to track all of that.
All right. Well, I know that people have further questions that we can ask them of Lynne at the reception. A little wine, a little cheese, little language games. So join me in thanking Lynne Tirrell.